Hello, I'm Brannon Howse, and welcome to the Worldview Weekend Hour. Tonight, I want to speak to you on the topic of the tactics and goals of the neo-marxists and Islamic revolutionaries. The tactics and goals of the neo-marxist and Islamic revolutionaries. One of the things I want you guys to understand tonight as we begin our program is a couple points that are very, very important to remember, and a few points that I should more often stress. Number one, working theories are always fluid. Tonight and in many of our programs, I put out what I believe are my theories or ideas of how I believe things will unfold. But these are working theories. We really don't know how some of these things will unfold. Now, when we turn to the scriptures, we can see what the Bible says will occur, but even then, some of them are not specific and precise as to the scriptural descriptions. So when we are working with theories, we have to remember they're just that, theories, and they're fluid. And we might need to revise and extend our theories as things unfold. It's kind of like a play. You can go to a play, and if you've never seen the play, you don't really know what's going to happen. You have Act 1 and Act 2 and Act 3, and you can have a theory as to where you think it's going, but you don't really know until the act has been played out. And that's where we are. Much of what we talk about, we document, we footnote, we provide the evidence, we provide the video clips. But when we talk about things that are going on worldwide and where they're going, we sometimes cannot be very specific, but simply just throw out theories. So working theories are fluid. Number two, I want you to understand that what is being built on a global scale are pieces of a puzzle. And many of the puzzle pieces for global governance have already been built. Many of the puzzle pieces that will one day fit together to provide global governance or provide for global governance, many of them have already been built. And they seem as though they have nothing to do with one another. One piece has nothing to do with another. That's what is the appearance. It's like taking a puzzle and scattering it out on this table. And all you see are a lot of pieces, and you don't see how they actually connect up. It's just a bunch of puzzle pieces. But as you begin to work the puzzle and move the pieces together, you see that indeed they do all fit together and provide a big picture. And that is the case with much of what is happening on a global scale today. Many of the global parts have been built to make for a global governance system. They just have not been hooked together yet. Let me give you an example. How many of you remember the Patriot Act? After 9/11, the Patriot Act was introduced. In a matter of days, it was introduced. How is it that this document that was many, many, many pages could be unveiled in a matter of days? How could it be written that quickly? Could it be that the Patriot Act was already written and simply waiting for the crisis to occur that would allow its implementation? Well, that I believe is indeed the case. And I believe there are many such pieces that have already been built, many such pieces of legislation that have already been written, that are simply waiting for the crisis to occur that will allow for the acceptance of their implementation. Here is an article that states that former counterterrorism czar Richard Clarke told Stanford law professor Lawrence Lessig, quote, "After 9/11, the government drew up the Patriot Act within 20 days, and it was passed." The Patriot Act is huge. And I remember someone asking a Justice Department official, how did they write such a large statute so quickly? And of course, the answer was that it has been sitting in the drawers of the Justice Department for the last 20 years, waiting for the event where they would pull it out, end quote. You see, my friends, point two I want you to understand tonight is that pieces of the puzzle have already and are already being built. They will fit together when the time is appropriate. When all of these various puzzle pieces that seem to have no connection one to the other are assembled in the proper time and in the proper order, the big picture of global governance will come into focus. Number three, I want you to understand this. Globalists will allow the dogs off the leash to further the conflict. Don't forget the old phrase by Saul Alinsky, the change comes from the conflict. The change comes from the conflict. Saul Alinsky, a neo-Marxist, a community organizer. Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, all studied Saul Alinsky. I've studied Saul Alinsky, but I've studied him as one who disagrees with him. They studied him as one who agrees with him. But Saul Alinsky, the neo-Marxist, said that the change comes from the conflict. Thesis and antithesis, idea, opposite idea. They fight, they merge together and produce change. And the process begins all over again. And what you need to understand is I believe many of the globalists have allowed the dogs off the leash to further the conflict. I believe we have globalists and we have people that do not have the best interests of America at heart, that have reached high places within our government and within many of our national security administration and offices and institutions. In fact, it's very sad, I believe, as I have friends that have worked for national security agencies that have told me that they want to do the right thing. They want to do what's right for America, what's consistent with the Constitution. They do not want to be politically correct. They want to uphold the laws of our land and protect the American people. But I've been told over the years by many of them that they are oftentimes not allowed to do their jobs. That indeed, those folks on the upper level in the administration of that agency are the ones that tie their hands from doing their jobs. And I think there are many good FBI agents that want to do the right thing that are not allowed to do so. Here's an example, I believe, of maybe folks in key places within our government, and oftentimes we do see that the neo-Marxists and the Muslims have been able to penetrate high government national security agencies. I believe what I'm about to read to you is an example of people allowing the dogs off the leash so there's conflict, and so that the conflict and the chaos can be used to bring together more puzzle pieces. Remember, the Patriot Act was reportedly written many, many years before it was implemented. They were just waiting on the right crisis to implement it. I believe a lot of times these crises are allowed to happen or they're manufactured so that the crises provides the opportunity for the change, for a complete remaking of the American system into a global system. Judicial Watch put out a press release on July 18th, 2016. Judicial Watch, Washington, D.C. It says, quote, Judicial Watch today released previously undisclosed documents from the St. Lucie, Florida Sheriff's Department revealing the FBI informed the Sheriff's Office in late 2013 that Omar Matten was, quote, not, end quote, a terrorist and was no threat to, quote, go postal, end quote. Perhaps you don't remember who Omar Patton is. He's the Muslim. He's the Muslim that swore allegiance to ISIS and murdered some 49 people in Orlando at that gay nightclub. Remember that? The attacks are becoming so frequent, it's hard to keep up and remember the names and the instances, isn't it? Because since Orlando, we've now had the murder of the Dallas police officers. And since Dallas, we've now had the murder of 3 Baton Rouge, Louisiana police officers by a young black man from Kansas City who went down to Baton Rouge and murdered these 3 police officers and who, according to numerous reports, had been a member of the Nation of Islam. Well, Omar Matten, who carried out the Orlando terrorist attacks, according to Judicial Watch, St. Lucie, Florida Sheriff's Department, revealing the FBI informed the Sheriff's Office in late 2013 that Omar Matten was, quote, not, end quote, a terrorist and was no threat to, quote, go postal, end quote. The email from the St. Lucie Sheriff's Department details the remarks were made during a phone conversation with Ronald Glass, the Florida regional resident in charge for the FBI. Other documents show Matten admitted to initially lying to the FBI about past statements tying him to the Boston Marathon bombers, the Fort Hood terrorist, and Al-Qaeda terrorist in Kenya, end quote. My friends, I would like to know then, why is it that this man was even on the street? Again, my theory is, folks, that globalist and agitators and neo-marxists will allow the dogs off the leash to allow for the desired conflict, because the change comes from the conflict. Number 4, it's all about the destruction of free market capitalism. That's what Black Lives Matter is about. That's what white privilege curriculum is about. That's what multiculturalism is really all about. It's not the study of multiple cultures. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the denigration of the foundational Western worldviews that include free market capitalism. Remember the words of Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1948. He said that my goal in life is to dethrone God and destroy capitalism. Capitalism, by the way, was a pejorative created by Karl Marx. It's really free market principles. We have all agreed to talk about it as capitalism, but that was really initially meant as a pejorative by Karl Marx. But everything that we see happening today in regards to things like the Black Lives Matter movement, white privilege, multiculturalism, and so many of these other movements, the Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, New Black Panthers, social justice, whatever you want to call it. It's all about the destruction of free market principles, free market capitalism in favor of the alternative, which is socialism, the economic philosophy of Karl Marx. It's also about the destruction of national sovereignty, because what is the goal of globalism? It isn't individual national sovereignty. Doesn't the Bible say that it's God who draws the borders of nations? Indeed it is. Isn't it interesting to note that God commanded the folks that came off the ark to spread out and to populate and to disperse? But no, what did they do? They gathered there in Babylon, 58 miles south of Baghdad, and they did not disperse and procreate. What they did is they congregated and they tried to establish power, and they disobeyed God and wanted to centralize government and power and rebel against God. God's plan was for people to disperse and to procreate. And thus you have borders of nations. And the Bible again says God in His sovereign authority draws the borders of nations. God allows certain things to happen, to allow certain nations to come into being and certain nations to be moved in closer and their borders tightened and others to enlarge. But God is sovereignly allowing things to occur. And so we see that globalism goes against God's initial plan and idea by consolidating power and saying, man, he will be as God. And globalism, thus, by its very essence, is the destruction of national sovereignty and borders. It is a building of a modern-day Tower of Babel. And I believe, as I detail in my book, The Coming Religious Reich, that it will indeed actually be built 58 miles south of Baghdad in actual Babylon, where it all began, Genesis 10 and 11. That's where we're all going back to, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 17 and 18. And so you need to understand that the destruction of free market principles or capitalism and national sovereignty and the destruction of individual freedoms for collectivism, which is socialism, is the goal. It's all about, folks, the destruction of free market capitalism, national sovereignty, and individual freedoms, which means the destruction of those principles and ideas is the end-end destruction of America. And that's the goal, to see that America is absorbed into a globalist system, that this capitalist system of America, this free market principle and principles of America are destroyed, and America is absorbed into a European-style socialism with a Eurocentric world government. I believe that's exactly what's happening, and I lay it out in great detail in my book, The Coming Religious Reich. Almost 600 pages, over 600 footnotes. You can get a copy at worldviewweekend.com/bookstore. The shorter URL, wvwtv.com/bookstore. You can download it now as an ebook. You can download it as an audiobook, or you can purchase the hardcover copy right now at wvwtv.com/bookstore. But I believe that's what's happening, folks. So as we get into tonight's program, which is again titled The Tactics and Goals of the Neo-Marxists and Islamic Revolutionaries, what I want you to understand, again, number one, we have working theories and they're fluid, and we must change our theories as we watch things unfolding. Two, pieces of the puzzle have already been built and are being built that will eventually come together to form the big picture, a globalist system. Three, the globalists in high places within the governments of the world, I believe, will allow the dogs off the leash to further the conflict that they will then use to implement the different pieces of the puzzle. And then four, it's all about the destruction of free market capitalism, national sovereignty, and individual freedoms. Now, I want to look tonight at the neo-Marxists and the Islamic revolutionaries that are rising in America once again. And the reason I say once again is because if you watched our last television program, you will remember that this is not new. The Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, the communists, their desire to see guerrilla warfare break out in the cities of America. This is not new. This is something, again, members of Congress, the FBI director was warning about in the 50s and 60s. It's not new, but it's now regaining prominence. Remember, we talked about the Students for a Democratic Society, this communist group, and it gave birth to the Weather Underground, which I believe has laid foundation for what we're seeing today with Black Lives Matter. And remember, we talked about Eric Mann, one of the Weather Underground, reportedly discipling, if you will, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matters movement.